Sheriff's Department, open up. That was the first sound that shook me out of my quiet Saturday morning, and it wasn't the kind of knock you'd mistake for a neighbor checking in. It was hard, heavy, and aggressive, like someone was trying to beat the hinges off my front door. The words echoed across my cabin, and for a split second I wondered if one of my deputies had shown up with urgent news. But as soon as I heard the second voice, something didn't feel right. After wearing this badge for 15 years, I know my deputies like I know my own brothers and sisters. I've heard them on the radio at 2 in the morning, I've heard them yelling over gunfire, and I've heard them laugh in the squad room after long shifts. These weren't my people. These voices were strangers, and strangers don't come pounding on my door pretending they run this county. I stood perfectly still, boots planted on the wooden floor of my cabin, heart beating steady but sharp. My cabin sits out by Lakeview Road, on land I purchased outright. It's not part of any community association, it's not covered by any of their rules, and it's definitely not subject to some neighbor's power trip. That's why I moved here in the first place: peace, freedom, and space to breathe away from the endless barking of HOA board members who think their word is law. So hearing someone shouting, "Sheriff's Department," outside my home was strange enough, but the words that followed made it downright laughable. "We're here on orders from the HOA. You're in violation of community rules. Open up or we'll be forced to take action." I almost laughed right then and there. The HOA has no jurisdiction on my property. They've been harassing me ever since I moved here, trying to rope me into their little kingdom of fines and threats, but legally they can't touch me. That's in the county records. So the fact that they sent people to my door claiming to be law enforcement meant one thing: they'd taken their harassment to a whole new level. This wasn't a letter stuffed in my mailbox, this wasn't a rude note about grass height or paint colors. This was a felony staring me in the face. I stepped quietly to the window, just far enough back that they couldn't see my movement. Peeking through the blinds, I caught my first look at the so-called officers. The sight nearly made me shake my head in disbelief. Two men stood there in mismatched uniforms, their shirts untucked, patches crooked, and badges that looked like they'd been bought from a Halloween costume store. Their belts didn't even match. One had a holster strapped on sideways like he'd seen in a bad movie, and the other had pepper spray dangling loose. Parked in my driveway was a white cargo van with the words "Security Police" sloppily spray-painted on the side. No county plates, no markings, no official numbers. It was the most obvious fake cop act I'd ever seen. Right then, my gut told me the whole story. This was an HOA stunt. They were so desperate to scare me that they'd gone and hired a couple of wannabes to pretend to be officers. They thought they'd intimidate me into submission, maybe even trick me into handing over some kind of access or payment. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, is that the man standing inside that cabin, the man listening to their lies, was the actual sheriff of this county. They hadn't just messed with a stubborn neighbor. They'd messed with the law itself. I reached for the radio clip to the table near the door, thumb pressing down the button with calm precision. "Sheriff Barnes to dispatch," I said, voice low but steady. "Possible 459 in progress, suspects impersonating law enforcement. Location, Lakeview Cabin Road. I repeat, suspects impersonating law enforcement. Request immediate backup." There was a pause, then the dispatcher's voice came back, surprised. "Copy that, Sheriff. Units en route." I could almost imagine the look on her face, realizing that the sheriff himself was reporting a crime at his own front door. This wasn't something that happened every day. Meanwhile, the pounding got louder. The fake cops weren't patient men. One of them kicked hard at the bottom of the door, rattling the lock. "Last chance," he shouted. "Open up now or we'll break it down." His partner added, "You're in violation of HOA code, and you'll be arrested if you don't comply." That's when my blood boiled. I've faced down cartel smugglers, armed fugitives, and desperate men with nothing to lose, but this? This was a whole different kind of insult. They weren't just trying to break into my home, they were pretending to wear my badge, pretending to carry my authority, twisting the meaning of the uniform I've dedicated my life to. To me, that was personal. I took a slow breath, hand brushing the grip of my sidearm but not drawing it yet. I didn't need to escalate, not with my deputies minutes away. But I also wasn't about to let these clowns think they were in control. Every fiber of my being told me this was the moment to make a stand. The doorframe shook again with another hard kick. Dust fell from the wooden beams above me. They were determined, I'll give them that. But determination doesn't make a criminal smart. I stepped closer to the door, ready to end the charade. My boots thudded against the floorboards, the sound echoing just enough that they probably thought I was finally coming to surrender. They had no idea the man on the other side was preparing to turn their whole plan upside down. In my mind, I ran through the checklist: 2 suspects, poorly armed, no sign of firearms, 1 escape vehicle that wouldn't make it far once my deputies arrived. They had the element of surprise, but I had the law, the training, and the home field advantage. And more importantly, I had the badge they could only dream of faking. As I stood there, listening to them hurl threats through the wood, I felt a strange calm wash over me. This wasn't fear, and it wasn't anger anymore. It was resolve. They thought they could intimidate me into stepping aside. What they didn't know is that they had picked the wrong door, the wrong cabin, and the wrong man. And as my radio crackled again, a deputy's voice confirming they were less than 5 minutes out, I tightened my jaw and prepared to open that door myself. If these fake cops wanted a showdown, they were about to learn exactly what happens when you impersonate the law in the home of the real sheriff. The next kick rattled my door so hard I swore the frame was going to splinter. My patience had worn thin. I yanked the deadbolt, twisted the knob, and flung the door wide open with enough force that it slammed against the wall. The 2 men outside stumbled back like kids caught stealing candy. I didn't even have to reach for my weapon, just standing there in my full sheriff uniform, badge gleaming in the morning sun, was enough to make their mouths drop open. They hadn't expected to see the real law staring them down. And the best part? They didn't have the slightest clue that the man they'd been pretending to be was the one staring them in the face. Well, I said, my voice low and steady, the kind of tone I used in interrogation rooms. Looks like we've got ourselves a couple of lawmen here. Sheriff's Department, huh? I let the words hang in the air like a trap waiting to snap shut. The taller one tried to puff up his chest, but it was all bluster. He stammered something about enforcing community codes and orders from the HOA. His partner was worse off. His eyes darted from my badge to my belt, and his knees actually looked like they were knocking. If fear had a smell, it was rolling off him in waves. You've got 3 seconds to tell me why you're impersonating deputies on my porch, I said, stepping forward, boots crunching on the gravel. 3, 2. Before I even hit 1, the shorter man cracked. It's not what you think, he blurted. We were just hired for security. That's all. Security doesn't knock on doors screaming Sheriff's Department, I snapped back. Security doesn't threaten to break into people's homes. And security sure as hell doesn't pretend to arrest citizens under HOA orders. You 2 just committed felony impersonation. That's prison time, boys. I could see the panic set in. The tall one glanced over his shoulder at the van, like he was calculating his chances of sprinting to it and peeling out before I could stop him. The problem with that plan? I've been tackling suspects since before he learned how to shave. You're under arrest, I declared, and before he even registered what I'd said, I had his wrist twisted, his cheap badge pressed into the dirt, and a pair of county-issued cuffs locked around his hands. He yelped in pain and surprise, but I wasn't in the mood to play nice. That's when the second guy broke and bolted. He spun on his heels and sprinted toward the van, arms pumping wildly. I didn't hesitate. I launched after him, boots pounding the gravel driveway. He was quick, but not quick enough. I closed the distance, caught him by the collar, and yanked him backward so hard he slammed onto the ground with a grunt. His fake badge clattered across the stones, spinning like a cheap coin. "You want to resist?" I barked, pinning his arms behind him. "Go ahead. Add resisting arrest to the list. See how long you last behind bars." He didn't resist. He just groaned as I cuffed him and hauled him to his feet. By then, the sound of sirens was rolling down the road. My deputies arrived in force, 2 patrol cars, lights blazing, sirens screaming, tires spitting dust as they skidded to a stop. 4 deputies jumped out, weapons drawn, expecting a full-on firefight. Instead, they froze when they saw me standing there, holding 2 handcuffed wannabe cops by the scruffs of their necks. The looks on their faces were priceless, half relieved, half struggling not to burst out laughing. Deputy Collins muttered, "You've got to be kidding me," as he holstered his sidearm. I shook my head. Wish I was. These 2 thought they could play dress-up, courtesy of our friends at the HOA. We searched the van, and that's when the whole scheme unraveled. Inside were binders full of bogus violation notices, stacks of blank tickets, and even a box of fake badges still wrapped in plastic. And the kicker? A manila envelope stuffed with paperwork connecting everything back to none other than Karen Thompson, the president of the HOA. Her name was scribbled on receipts, checks, and emails, all showing she had personally hired these 2 idiots to enforce community codes on properties outside her jurisdiction. Deputy Martinez pulled out one of the receipts and whistled. She actually paid them with HOA funds. Thousands of dollars. I felt my jaw tighten. Not only had she sent imposters to my door, she had used her neighbor's money to do it. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was conspiracy. We loaded the 2 men into the back of patrol cars, their bravado completely gone. They sat slumped, staring at the floorboards, knowing their lives had just taken a sharp turn toward prison. But I wasn't finished. As far as I was concerned, the real mastermind was still sitting comfortably in her big house, probably sipping coffee and waiting for news that her little intimidation stunt had worked. She had no idea that instead of a victory, she had just declared war on the wrong man. Standing there in the driveway, watching my deputies bag up evidence, I thought back to the countless times this HOA had tried to push me around. The letters, the fines, the threats about mandatory membership. I had ignored them all because I knew the law was on my side. But this was personal. They had impersonated my badge, my office, and my deputies. That was a line you don't cross. I turned to my deputies. Get those 2 booked on felony impersonation, attempted home invasion, conspiracy, and anything else the DA can stick to them. Then put together a report for the prosecutor. I'll handle the rest. Collins raised an eyebrow. You're going after Karen yourself, aren't you? I gave a thin smile. Damn right I am. The ride back into town felt different that day. I wasn't just the sheriff handling a routine arrest. I was a man whose authority had been mocked, whose home had been threatened, and whose badge had been dragged through the mud by a power-hungry neighbor who thought she was above the law. She was about to learn the hard way that my badge isn't a toy, and my county isn't her playground. When we pulled away from my cabin, the van was still sitting there like a monument to stupidity, spray-painted letters peeling in the sun. My deputies towed it later, but for me, it was already seared into memory as the dumbest attempt at intimidation I'd ever seen. And believe me, I've seen plenty. As the patrol cars carried the impersonators off toward county jail, I stood in the dust for a moment, staring out over the lake. The water was calm, the sun just beginning to climb over the horizon, and for a split second, I thought about how quiet life was supposed to be here. That peace was exactly why I'd bought this cabin. But if the HOA thought they could rip it away from me, they had just made their last mistake. Because now it wasn't just about me. It was about everyone in that neighborhood who had been bullied, fined, and harassed by a president who thought she had more power than the law itself. It was about setting an example so bold that nobody would ever dare to pull a stunt like this again. The time for letters and warnings was over. It was time for me to show Karen, and the entire HOA, that when you play sheriff, the real one shows up at your door. By the time noon rolled around, the two impersonators were locked behind bars at the county jail. Their mug shots were already being processed, their fake uniforms tossed in the evidence room, and their cheap badges catalogued as proof of the crime. I had watched plenty of criminals sit on that bench, staring at the scuffed tile floor, realizing their whole plan had just gone up in smoke. But seeing these two sitting there, twitchy and pale, was different. They hadn't just tried to rob a house or hustle a scam. They had tried to steal the image of my badge, the authority of my office, and the trust the community put in me. And that wasn't something I was going to let slide with just a slap on the wrist. As I walked out of the jail, the evidence bag tucked under my arm, my deputies fell in step with me. Colin spoke first. "What's the next move, Sheriff? We got enough to nail Karen with conspiracy, but you know she'll have lawyers lined up before sunset." I nodded. "Oh, I know. But this isn't just about what she did to me. This is about every family she's squeezed, every kid she's bullied, every veteran she's harassed. She's been running that HOA like her personal fiefdom. Now we've got proof she took it too far. She sent armed men to impersonate officers. That's not an HOA violation, that's a felony. And I'm going to make sure she faces every last charge." We rolled out toward her neighborhood in 2 squad cars. The streets were lined with manicured lawns and expensive SUVs, the kind of place where people paid top dollar to feel safe and orderly. But behind all that polish, you could feel the tension. I'd heard the complaints for months, neighbors too scared to stand up to her, people paying ridiculous fines for nonsense like hanging the wrong holiday lights or leaving a bike on the porch. Karen had turned her position into a throne, and she ruled it like a tyrant. When I stepped out of the patrol car in front of her sprawling brick home, she came to the door with her usual smug smile. She probably thought her plan had succeeded, that the fake cops had done their job and forced me into submission. She had no idea the tables had already turned. But the moment she saw me flanked by 2 uniformed deputies, her smile cracked. "Mrs. Thompson," I said, holding up the evidence bag with her signed receipts inside, "we need to talk." Her voice trembled just a little. "Sheriff, I don't understand. What's this about?" I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You sent 2 men to my home this morning. They impersonated deputies. They threatened to break down my door. And when we searched their van, we found checks written from your HOA account. With your signature. You want to explain that?" Her face went pale. She started sputtering excuses, claimed it was just a compliance check, said she had no idea they would use fake badges, insisted it was a misunderstanding. But the paperwork in my hand told a different story. The emails we found showed she had specifically instructed them to look official and show authority. That wasn't a misunderstanding, that was intent. I let her ramble for a moment, then cut her off cold. "Save it for the prosecutor. Right now, you're under investigation for conspiracy to impersonate law enforcement, misuse of HOA funds, and attempted unlawful entry." Her eyes widened. "You can't be serious. I was just doing my duty as HOA president. You don't understand, this neighborhood needs order." I leaned in, letting the weight of my words sink in. "You don't enforce order by breaking the law, Karen. You don't keep a community safe by sending thugs in Halloween costumes to terrorize your neighbors. You abused your position, and now the law is coming for you." The deputies behind me were stone-faced, but I could tell they were enjoying watching the queen of the HOA squirm. For years, they had fielded petty calls from her, complaints about kids riding skateboards, flags hung the wrong way, lawn ornaments she didn't like. Now she was finally facing consequences of her own. We didn't cuff her that afternoon, but we served her with notice. The county had frozen the HOA's funds pending investigation, and she was ordered to appear for questioning. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. By the time we were back in town, my office was flooded with phone calls, residents thanking me, sharing their own horror stories, begging us to dig deeper. Some had been fined hundreds of dollars for leaving trash cans out for a few extra minutes. Others had been threatened with lawsuits for planting the wrong flowers. One veteran even told me Karen demanded he take down his American flag because it didn't match the community aesthetic. It became clear this wasn't just about me. This was about justice for an entire neighborhood. And the prosecutor agreed. By the end of the week, charges were formally filed, not just against the two impersonators, but against Karen herself. Conspiracy. Fraud. Misuse of funds. She went from president of the HOA to defendant in a courtroom, and the look on her face when the charges were read was worth every second of the fight. The next HOA meeting was the final nail in her coffin. Word had gotten out, and nearly the entire neighborhood showed up. For once, Karen didn't sit at the head of the table barking orders. She sat in the back, pale and silent, as the community she had tormented for years finally stood up. One by one, they voted her out of office, unanimously. She left the room without a word, her reign of intimidation shattered. And me? I went back to my cabin on the lake, the place I had chosen for peace and quiet. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the water glowed gold, I sat on my porch and thought about how fast things had escalated. What started as a couple of thugs pounding on my door ended with a tyrant dethroned and a community free from her grip. The truth is, bullies like Karen always think they're untouchable. They believe rules are for everyone else, not them. They surround themselves with power, money, and people too scared to fight back. But the second someone stands up, someone who won't bend, who won't be intimidated, the whole illusion crumbles. She thought she could use fake cops to scare me. She didn't realize the man she sent them after was the real sheriff. That's the story I'll always tell when people ask about that day. I'll tell them about the pounding on my door, the cheap costumes, the panic in their eyes when they realized who I was. And I'll tell them how the HOA president who thought she could bend the law to her will ended up being bent by it herself. Because at the end of the day, authority isn't about titles or uniforms. It's about trust, responsibility, and standing up for what's right. And no matter how much power an HOA president thinks she has, she'll never outrank the law. That's why I smile every time I look out at the lake now. Because I know I stood my ground, I defended my home, and I reminded a whole neighborhood that real law doesn't come in the form of threats, fines, or fake badges. Real law is about protecting people, not controlling them. And the next time someone thinks about impersonating an officer, they'll remember the two men who ended up cuffed in the dirt and the HOA president who lost everything because she sent them after the wrong man.